Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen quite an incredible level of topsy-turviness really across the labour market over the last few years of COVID-19, but the pressure really is on now. It seems to be that everyone we talk to is really struggling to get staff. The latest monthly employment numbers are showing that underlying jobs activity looks like it's flat, if not declining. I mean, is there much more that the labour market has in it to be able to find all of this new talent that we apparently need?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the numbers would suggest the economy is softening, but our interpretation of what's going on with employment when you talk to people is that everybody is still desperate for work. I mean, yes, Omicron threw a bit of a hole in terms of the way the economy was performing, but man, people still needed more workers because everybody was off sick or isolating and that type of thing. And so, yeah, an increasing desperation to the point where I'd say some of those labour market issues and that tightness there, the lack of workers that are available, is probably almost usurping concerns around the supply chain as being the number one concern now for businesses. So the fact that we haven't really seen job numbers growing over the last 6 months or so says to me that there's just nobody left to employ that you're willing or able to take on now. So it is a very unusual situation. Normally there's always some spare capacity in the labour market, but it's just not the case at the moment.
No, and we saw with the first 3 months of the year an expectation that, things might soften back a bit in the employment space, not really coming to pass. The total number of hours worked in the economy on a seasonally adjusted basis down 0.2%. Now, really, that's nothing in the scheme of things, given that we had at one point a peak of over 300,000 people having to be off with COVID-19 or isolating. And so the feeling very much is that we've been pushing some workers very, very hard to make up the slack and keep things operating at a time when disruption has been even higher. We know from some of our analysis that leave balances look like they're up about 25% over the last year. I mean, we really have built up a head of steam, but I mean, what are businesses going to need to do, or what are they currently doing to try and address this at a time when we know that it's so difficult and that those pressures are continuing to come forward? Realistically, that's got to be wage increases, right?
Yeah, we're not seeing a great deal of it yet in the official data. I mean, some of the measures that it is showing through that there is cost pressure there, and it does tend to be a lagging indicator, but it has been surprising, I think, through 2021 just how subdued some of those pressures are. But increasingly, yeah, you talk to people and they talk about how much more they're having to pay to attract staff and retain staff as well. And certainly through the course of the next 12 to 18 months, expecting to see that become much more evident in terms of those official indicators of where wages are going, particularly when you consider that the CPI is running at 7%. So cost of living there for workers is rising substantially as well. Of course, the other factor which is making it hard to find workers is with the borders reopening, and we're seeing more Kiwis heading overseas. I mean, what are we seeing in those migration numbers at the moment?
Well, nothing good. The latest numbers from Stats NZ still showing quite a considerable outflow of over 7,000 people net a year. Again, the first time that we've seen that sort of net outflow since the GFC, the Christchurch earthquakes, and the Australian mining boom all sort of combined together. So it is incredibly challenging when, for every worker you're trying to find, the labour pool is actually getting smaller. And it's particularly concentrated around those younger workers. Analysis from one of our economists, Joel Glynn, has been showing that it's young people, it's your 20 to 30-year-olds who are very much moving away quite quickly. It comes at a time when the government has had to very quickly reevaluate what it might be able to do on the migration front, bringing forward the opening of the borders to skilled workers, creating a new green list, which is basically like what we used to sort of do a few years back. But at the same time, we've seen that there's even more upheaval coming forward. It looks like Australia, with their new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wanting to increase the likes of the minimum wage and similar there, which could well drive even more people across the ditch. I mean, realistically, I think New Zealand's got to be prepared for at least a year where it is not only difficult to find workers, but at a time when really there's going to be quite a sustained net loss of talent, and businesses are going to have to quite considerably, I think, reconsider and reevaluate what their capacity is to deliver on some of these big jobs.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, historically, when you look at New Zealand, our productivity performance has been very poor. One of the slowest growing economies in terms of productivity in the OECD for the last 20 years and longer. We look at businesses to invest in more machinery and equipment and sort of labour saving devices, and I think, look, that is occurring. We see that in the likes of the retail sector, for example. But at a time, of course, when interest rates are rising and there's uncertainty about the sort of strength of demand over the next couple of years with the effects of tighter monetary policy coming through, there probably is going to be a bit of a reluctance from businesses to invest. We know, of course, that prices of machinery and equipment are rising with the sort of demand conditions and shipping disruptions, supply chain disruptions around the world as well. So it is hard to see a path for the New Zealand economy to actually achieve much growth, given what we're seeing with the labour market and then some of those pressures around investment activity as well.
Absolutely, and look, we've continued to hear that directly from businesses that they feel like they are stuck between a bit of a rock and a hard place. It's incredibly challenging to find that additional labour resource, but it's also very expensive, and also sometimes from a supply point of view, impossible to very quickly find that new investment or find the people to install it and similar. So a real challenge there. But I think what really strikes me still is that the latest numbers from Seek show that there's a 15% increase in April 2022 compared to a year ago in terms of job ads. But again, it comes at a time when we know that the workforce has actually declined in recent times. The number of people available to do some of that work is very, very limited. It's shrinking at a time when we want to be doing more. And it does make you worried, I guess, that we do loom down the face of that dreaded R word, recession, although not like a recession that we've seen before. It's not going to be a huge collapse in demand and similar. People are probably still going to have their jobs. It's just that the domestic economy probably isn't going to have enough resource to try and actually get everything done. And if that's the case, we're going to have to import a lot of that from overseas. But I mean, what is that outlook for bringing in foreign talent? Presumably still relatively limited.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about the green list and the sort of occupations that the government is targeting there. Not a great deal different to what we had prior to COVID. Not a lot of sort of, I guess, initiative or innovation in that space. My worry, though, is, Immigration New Zealand is still pushing its way and struggling its way through the 2021 resident visas. From all reports, they are progressing more slowly than had initially been expected. Maybe that's not a surprise, given that, of course, immigration in NZ had its capacity severely cut when COVID hit. But it's all very slow. And look, for a government that its rhetoric around immigration has been relatively negative through the course, certainly prior to election, and then through the course of the last couple of years as well. They're probably not too uncomfortable in some respects. They're more pragmatic, I think, about the need to bring in workers for selected occupations and industries, but they're not going to be falling over themselves to, throw open the border wider and make it that much easier and, throw a lot more capacity at Immigration New Zealand. So, no, I think those inflows are going to remain relatively subdued. Of course, as you mentioned, incomes in Australia and opportunities potentially in Australia, which mean that, even trying to attract foreign migrants, that we are still going to be, I guess, competing, pushing a little bit up against a bit of a brick wall or a bit of an impediment there with the strength of the Australian economy as well. Yeah, so not easy, and that has contributed to a more negative outlook for net migration than we had maybe 3 or 4 months ago when we were just starting to think about the possibility of a brain drain.
Absolutely, and I mean that just underscores how much these sort of conditions are changing. We've known that businesses have been under a huge amount of pressure on the workforce side, and that pressure continues to build, and really by our estimates doesn't look like it's going to get any better anytime soon. We will, though, continue to follow what happens there, what happens with net migration, what the flows into and out of New Zealand are, and where the broader workforce starts to move, including where those pay packets start to shift on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.